Sextus Cloelius, Clodius's Majordomo, 58 to 52 BCE. For Roman senators to pursue ambitious reform programs, or even just to operate a patronage network and secure electoral success, it required the participation of multiple people, not all of whom had attained senatorial status. The greatest senators not only had junior colleagues and trusted followers, but a right-hand man to coordinate efforts, someone who could be the representative in all matters. Pompey had Lucius Vibullius Rufus, Mark Antony had Quintus Delius, and Publius Clodius Pulcher had Sextus Cloelius. Immersed in all of his patrons' controversies, Cloelius attracted much more attention in the forensic oratory and letters of Cicero and his pals than the man's relatively low status as a scribe might seem to warrant. From Cicero's writings, Cloelius appears not only as someone who wielded powers wildly beyond his station, but also as yet another member of Clodia's reverse harem of semi-elite males. Here, however, we will be interpreting Sextus Cloelius's career in its historical context, requiring us to ask a couple of crucial questions. First, what was his actual status and relationship with Clodius? Second, how much power did Cloelius actually have in his own right? While pursuing answers to these questions, we will trace Cloelius's rocky and blood-stained path through the 50s BCE, how he fared after the sudden death of his patron, and the insights on the late Republic we can glean from studying the careers of men like Cloelius, who were crucial to actually getting things done. Due to our knowledge of Roman gentes and a fairly abundant record of inscriptions and literary references, we can largely reproduce the line of descent of many Roman senators, at least in broad strokes. When it comes to other members of Roman society, however, we are not nearly so informed about their family tree. Sextus Cloelius, we know for certain, was not a senator, nor did he have senatorial relatives. We also know that he did not come from Rome proper, but rather from Terracina, which was 56 miles south of Rome in Campania along the Appian Way. We know that he's a scribe. We'll talk about Roman scribes in a little while. That means that there are two possible statuses that he could have possessed. One is that he was a freedman, and the other is that he was a free person who happened to join the order of scribes. W. Jeffrey Tatum and other modern scholars are of the belief that he was not a freedman, but rather from one of the rising families from the provinces, and that he was using this position of scriba as a way to enter into Roman politics. Given that he will become Clodius's right-hand man, I am inclined to agree with Tatum that he was, in fact, born free rather than a freedman. Cicero mentions Cloelius a few times in his speeches, but it's only just to take shots at his low status and poor character. He gives us the impression that Cloelius was a nobody who was just a hanger-on with Clodius and Clodia, someone who was of no real account, except that he had been elevated far beyond his station. That's not very helpful when trying to reconstruct who Cloelius was and why he was there. It's only the historian Asconius, who was born in the era of Augustus and lived until Vespasian's reign, that we learn a little bit more. And what we learn is that he was a scriba, that he was a member of an order of scribes. As for these Roman scribes, they could either be private secretaries, or they were members of a public decurii, or sort of like a public order or guild of scribes. And what they did was to work with senators, to make sure that a lot of the legwork that senators, one, wouldn't have time to do, and two, wouldn't have the inclination to do, got done. So these are guys who made sure that bills were written in the proper format, that papers were delivered when needed, things of that nature. So they do a lot of grunt work. But to do that, they still have to be highly skilled, and they have to be educated and very literate. Most of the men in those public orders would be assigned to senators when they were elected to office, but they would not be beholden to particular individuals. So these would be kind of like bureaucrats who rotate between the elected magistrates. And yes, for all practical intents and purposes, the scribes were more or less the minimal bureaucracy that the late Republic had. So these are the professionals who are attached to senators to make sure they can get jobs performed. We also believe that these scribes were actually fairly influential, so while they don't have that much official status, and some of them are freedmen, still, because of their specialized skills and because there just aren't that many of them, the senators still respected them. Not to mention that if they are handling paperwork, they potentially could, through malicious compliance or sabotage, set senators up to take a fall. So you need to make sure that you treat them well, the same way you wouldn't want to insult a person who prepares your food. Anyhow, Cynthia Damon in 1991 argued that Cloelius was a member of the public order of scribes, and that he was then recruited from that order by Clodius to be his majordomo. And the reason is that Cloelius had all the requisite skills, he also had a little bit of status. So, again, I think Damon is probably assuming that he was a man born free in Terracina, and he was someone who had just enough stature to be credible. He also got to see Cloelius in action early during his time as tribune. So at the same time that Clodius was sworn in January 58, Cloelius was at the head of the Ludi Compitalici, and this gave Clodius the sense that Cloelius was a man with some ability. He had a little bit of presence to him, he had some size, and he was not shy. So those things would have made Clodius pay attention, and then approach the man and secure his personal loyalty. Publius Clodius Pulcher was a young man with a lot of ambition and a strong personality. Although he had agreed to do the bidding of the First Triumvirate on some matters, he was not completely beholden to them. After all, he was a Claudius by birth, and he was highly aware of that fact. He was not any man's servant. He had his own agenda, and he intended to pursue it. The triumvirate be damned. When things started, it was a pretty workable partnership, however, as the triumvirs agreed to allow Clodius to do his Clodius things so long as he did what they needed him to do on the side. To get all of this passed, however, Clodius would need his own team, and so he decided to start building a group of men loyal primarily to himself. This is the origin both of his relationship with Cloelius and of his famous street gang that will terrorize Rome for the next several years. We're pretty sure that when Clodius recruited Cloelius, whether Cloelius was assigned to him in 58 or whether he simply recruited the man and hired him to be a private scribe, we're pretty sure that Cloelius's role was to be the guy who actually does the drafting of the legislation. So the bills we're about to talk about were most likely written by, or at least the writing of them was supervised by, Sextus Cloelius, a man who understood how legislation had to be written. Asconius also tells us that Clodius was able to pass 4 popular bills, all of which were the sources of his popularity. And one of them was actually the Lex Frumentarium, which gave Clodius at the time unprecedented authority over the food supply, and it also started a grain dole with up to 320,000 recipients in the city of Rome. So this was a huge piece of legislation, and it also gained Clodius a great deal of support. If we are correct in assuming that Cloelius was there to offer technical advice, as it were, then he, in fact, was the guy who figured out exactly what the parameters of the bill would be, and Clodius was more of the public face of the operation. Had Cloelius's involvement in the grain legislation been limited to merely drafting bills, then there would really be very little to discuss. This was simply how things were done. Scribes often worked out the details, and senators were largely just there to promote the bills and to do broad strokes legislating rather than getting into the fine-grained details. However, Cloelius's involvement was a bit deeper than that, because not only did he help to draft the legislation, but he also apparently was empowered to be a grain commissioner. He was actually making decisions and handing out grain, at least if Cicero's account is accurate. In De Domo Sua, Cicero tells us that, "By the terms of your law," he's addressing Clodius, "you handed over to Sextus Cloelius all publicly and privately owned grain, all grain-producing provinces, all contracts, every key to the granaries. And what he's getting at is that Cloelius was not an elected official. He's not someone who won the people's trust. He was simply given these powers, and we don't know what he's going to do with them. He goes on to talk about how Cloelius is degenerate and greedy and filthy. He doesn't really give any specific examples, but he just is smearing the man in very broad strokes because he knows that Cloelius does not have the sufficient stature to fight back in the law courts in any way. So he can just smear the man relentlessly, and no harm will come to Cicero for it unless Clodius inflicts it. But at this point, Cicero's back from his exile, and so he's vengeful. He blames Cloelius for any complicity whatsoever. Now, in terms of Cloelius' actual involvement, Cicero is almost certainly exaggerating. He often does that. Anyone who's read his letters or his speeches knows that. That being said, it is quite likely that Clodius did choose to make Cloelius some kind of administrator within his grain legislation, because Cloelius knew the bill inside and out. After all, he wrote the damn thing. He ought to. And Clodius was empowered to delegate as he saw fit. This was also true of previous grain commissions and previous land commissions. Back when Tiberius Gracchus had passed his famous land law, he made the other two commissioners his younger brother, who as yet had not held a seat in the Senate, and his father-in-law. So you could make whoever you wanted into a grain commissioner. This is also evidence, of course, that Cloelius was someone from a free family who had at least a little bit of standing in Terracina, rather than being a freedman, because if he had been a freedman, then that would have been a major scandal, and Cicero almost certainly would have made a big deal about that, and called him a freedman about 28 times in the speech. But because he doesn't say it even once, he's almost certainly talking about Cloelius as a freedman, not as a freedman, but as a free person who simply just wasn't of the upper class. In Roman politics, the more that any tribune accomplished, the more backlash there was. So most likely, Clodius' strategy was to get all of his stuff passed as quickly as possible before he could be accused of seeking power and shut down by the opposition. That being said, he already had a rival, perhaps someone who had been an enemy since childhood, Lucius Nennius Quadratus. And Quadratus happened to be a fellow tribune. He was also an ally of Cicero, and therefore not terribly infatuated with Clodius and Clodius's agenda. Tatum is of the belief that because the agriculture bill was so popular, and because it did have the backing of the triumvirs, that Nennius and other opponents of Clodius decided to just let that one pass. They knew it was a lost cause. Instead, they tried to dent Clodius's prestige by attacking some games he was trying to get going. And this, of course, would make him look ineffective and as if he were not fulfilling his promises. But the main target, Tatum believes, of Nennius' assaults was on the establishment of more collegia. These collegia were associations that would help to increase Clodius' power base. And in fact, when Clodius does pass his bill to create and fund more colleges, and by colleges in this case we don't mean institutions of learning, but rather more like guilds or social clubs, this did in fact give Clodius a big boost to his power base. So for Nennius, this would have been the smart play to make, to avoid putting himself out there opposed to something everybody wanted, and instead go after the thing that would give Clodius lasting institutional sway. Of course, this attack failed famously, and apparently it was because Clodius was able to make it look like Nennius was overreacting and being ridiculous. So he was able to allay the fears of enough of Nennius' optimate allies to make sure that they didn't insist on imposing a veto. It's also worth mentioning that most of this faction was still feeling pretty broken from the consulship of Julius and Caesar, when Caesar had simply ridden roughshod over Bibulus. So they were looking for a way to fight back, but they weren't sure the time was ripe yet, and Nennius came along a little too early. Because he didn't have backing from any of his ostensible allies, Nennius also did not impose his tribunician veto. So once again, this was a major piece of legislation for building up Clodius and his power base, and it will become law. Also, of course, Cloelius wrote it. Back in the 60s, when Pompey had taken over Lucullus's command and defeated Mithridates, he had also defeated Armenia. Tigranes the Great was king at the time. He had sided with his in-law Mithridates and was also defeated by the Romans. However, his kingdom was not broken up. That being said, he did have to give up his son as hostage. And my guess, although I cannot prove it, is that the son in question was the future Artavasdes II of Armenia. He was taken back to Rome to serve as a hostage. Being a hostage, if you're of the upper class, largely means being a house guest whose movements are slightly limited, but you'll still have access to most of the luxuries you could want, and you can also roam about within reason. So he was residing as a guest of sorts at the home of Lucius Flavius, the praetor of 58. Well, Flavius, as a fellow magistrate, had Clodius over for dinner one night, and Clodius met with the prince. He then used his tribunician's sacrosanct status, that being that he can't be physically touched by anyone else without it being an offense against the gods, and he removed the prince to a different place. He then put the prince on a ship and wanted to send him home. So this was a fairly explicit act of rebellion against Pompey. Up to this point, Clodius and Pompey had been sort of working together, although they didn't really like each other that much, and this is one of the first open breaks. Now, this plan would have been just a straight-up coup against Pompey in a way, except that Mother Nature had other plans. So as the ship was sailing down the west coast of Italy, a storm broke out, and the ship was forced to make for land at Antium in the south. Now there's a scramble to get to Antium to retrieve the prince, who is on the run, and is supposed to be back in Rome serving as a hostage. One can only imagine that tensions were mounting, and apparently Clodius was intent upon pursuing a different strategy than his initial one. Rather than sending the prince directly back to Armenia, he decided for whatever reason that it would be more advantageous to have the prince in Rome with him. Perhaps he intended to trade the prince for some other political concession. And so he dispatched Sextus Cloelius with a gang of men to retrieve the prince and take him back to Rome. Here, he could be kept at Clodius's house, where he could continue to use his tribunician sacrosanctity, or he could house the boy with a close ally. Whatever it took, the intention was clearly to keep the prince away from Pompey. Lucius Flavius, for his part, was livid with the way he had been treated. He too was a sitting magistrate of Rome, and his hospitality rights had been violated by Clodius's very opportunistic use, perhaps unprecedented, of his sacrosanct status to kidnap someone from his home. So he too raised a body of men, and unlike Clodius, he was going to go in person. He knew Clodius wouldn't be there, and so if violence happened, he would be willing to inflict it. The two bodies of men marched south to Antium. It looks like Cloelius got there first and secured the prince. Then the two forces clashed on the Appian Way. And in this battle, a number of men died. Most of them were men of low status, perhaps hired gladiators or attendants. One man of note did die, though, and that man was Marcus Papirius, a publican or tax collector of equestrian status who was one of Pompey's confidants. So effectively, he was to Pompey what Cloelius was to Clodius. And Pompey was pretty pissed about the death of Papirius. Because this had resulted in bloodshed, and this was one of the first times that a gang battle had occurred, this scandal now took precedence over the cause of the scandal, which was the abduction of the prince. Interestingly enough, our sources do not record the prince's subsequent life. We don't actually know whether he was Artavasdes and he made it home to assume the throne a couple years later. We simply have no idea. All we know is that now the focus is on the fact that violence has been committed against a friend of Pompey, and Pompey and Clodius are bitter enemies and will remain so for the next few years. Thus, Sextus Cloelius had been the leader of a gang battle on Clodius's behalf, and as such, he was the man who would have to face the music for the death of Papirius. This was a very serious trial, and because Papirius had died, it meant that Pompey wanted Cloelius convicted and exiled. And Pompey, of course, was the most influential man in Rome at the time. So Cloelius must have been under an immense amount of stress. His career, which had suddenly taken off and brought him to prominence, was on the precipice. He might face complete and total ruin. Of course, Clodius would back up Cloelius in this trial. This would bring out a lot of the big guns in Rome. For instance, Milo, who would later become a bitter and completely devoted enemy of Clodius, showed up for the prosecution to try to get Cloelius convicted. We don't know too many other details about the prosecution and defense. After all, while this trial would have been one of the most stressful moments in Cloelius' life, it was not necessarily the trial of the century simply because the man being prosecuted was someone of a relatively low stature. In the end, it was not the merits of the case that decided the day, but rather the expediency of the politics behind the scenes. Cloelius ended up being acquitted, and this was largely because Clodius was now seen as a useful tool by the Optimates. They may not have approved of his methods, they may not have approved of his adoption, or anything about him really, but one thing that they did approve of was the fact that he was causing problems for Pompey. And the name of the game in the Senate was always to maintain a balance of power among the oligarchy. If any one member became too powerful, this upset the balance. Clodius was becoming too powerful, but it would take him years to reach the kind of power that Pompey had. So in the meantime, why not use him to take down Pompey, and then Clodius's wings can be clipped later. As for Cloelius, well, he could be taken out very easily, so why not preserve him for now as a way to show support for Clodius and empower him to do more things that would undermine Pompey. Cicero, as many in the Senate were, was deeply upset by the outcome, and he could only sniff about the activities and lives of the lesser hirelings of Publius Clodius. For Sextus Cloelius, the year 58 was, without a doubt, the key year in his life. A lot had happened, and he had come out on top in the end, although it had been a close-run thing. Almost everything that we know about Cloelius came from that year. His involvement in two major pieces of legislation, his battle with a praetor, and his acquittal. But we know that he remained active behind the scenes and a dedicated follower of Clodius all the way up until Clodius's own death. In the meantime, we can only really speculate about what Cloelius might have been up to. He most likely had a great deal to say, and none of it particularly positive, about Pompey's performance when Pompey took over Clodius's duties as the organizer of grain. Needless to say, Cloelius was not retained as a commissioner, and so he most likely found fault with whatever practices Pompey did. I'm sure that he told anyone who would listen about how Pompey's methods were less efficient. Whether that was true or not is unclear. Pompey was actually a very good administrator, but one imagines that Cloelius would have found fault however possible. After all, he and Pompey were now enemies, at least by proxy. Perhaps Cloelius was keeping a bit of a lower profile. Maybe he didn't want to do any more commissions or to lead any more gang battles. He could very well have participated in a lot of them, for all I know, but my suspicion is that because he did have at least a little bit to lose and was not a man who was truly desperate, that he probably stepped back a bit and allowed others to lead the fight in the streets. One thing that would bring him out, though, and show that he had not lost his ardor for Clodius's cause, was when Clodius died at the hands of Milo in yet another battle on the Appian Way. This, for Cloelius, was an outrage that he could not countenance. His friend, mentor, and patron was gone, and he was having none of it. In early 52, an armed band under Clodius passed a larger armed band under Milo on the Appian Way. Neither leader wanted a scuffle. However, one broke out because the gladiators on each side started talking trash and started exchanging blows. In the ensuing melee, Clodius was mortally wounded. He then died shortly thereafter. This created a political firestorm in Rome, as most of Clodius's supporters were of the belief that this was a deliberate assassination and a plot against both their beloved leader and their cause. So they were furious. Taking advantage of this, Fulvia, the widow of Clodius, teamed up with many of his senior followers, including Sextus Tidius, Titus Munatius Plancus, and Quintus Pompeius Rufus. They, of course, were joined by Cloelius. By this point, Cloelius had had enough experience to know how to get a crowd worked up. He had led men in battle, at least once. He might have even been at the famous battle where Clodius died. But Cloelius played a key role here. He reminded his listeners of Clodius's legislative achievements, and these would be things that he was very well qualified to talk about, since in fact he was familiar with the details that he had written. And so he reminded them of the gains that had been made on their behalf in the Lex Frumentaria, and the power that they enjoyed due to the Lex de Collegiis, both of which had been done when Clodius was tribune, and Cloelius was writing these things. Those things were responsible for the bulk of the support that Clodius had enjoyed to this day. And so, fired up by Clodius, and by the tears of Fulvia, and by the urging of the other three men, the crowd broke into a full riot, and decided to utilize the Senate House as a funeral pyre for the deceased Publius Clodius Pulcher. This was one of the truly great riots in Roman history. Clodius's death and the immolation of the Senate House led to a raft of lawsuits. In order to appease the mob that had burned the Senate House, the Romans decided to convict and exile Milo. This would hopefully restore order. In the meantime, however, many in the Senate blamed the leaders of that mob and wanted them gone as well. Cicero worked as a prosecutor and personally saw to it that Plancus and Pompeius Rufus were banished from the city. As for Cloelius, he too was convicted and exiled, although because his status was not senatorial, we don't really know the circumstances. It's also very likely that this was something that was left in the hands of lesser prosecutors. So we know very few details except that the prosecution succeeded. So, from 52 on, Cloelius will be in exile. Most likely he went to Massilia, the same place where senators from Rome went when they were exiled. He spent about 8 years in the city that would one day become Marseille. He would be recalled, not in 49 in Caesar's general pardon, which apparently only affected senators, but rather by a special provision passed by Mark Antony, who was consul in 44. So one of the things that Antony did in the brief period when there was something like a period of peace between himself and the assassins of Caesar was to get Cloelius brought back to Rome. The speculation is that he didn't do this as a move that advanced his own cause, but rather as a way to try to win over the younger Publius Clodius Pulcher, who was not of office-holding age yet, but who wanted this as a way to honor his father's friend. This is a way to secure the support of a man who one day could provide useful aid to Antony. So again, for all of Cloelius's importance as a mover and shaker, as a gang leader, and as a drafter of bills, he ultimately was never more than a pawn in the grand scheme of Roman politics. In Roman politics, a lot of the dirty work was done by Roman scribes. In modern America, Capitol Hill staffers do most of the actual legislating when it comes to working out details, putting in long hours, and doing the hard work of government. They are typically vastly underpaid, most of them are also under 30, and they are often asked to spend hours and hours locked inside rooms getting work done, while senators and congressmen go on television and complain about how hard they're working. So it's much the same relationship, where there's one group doing all the work, another group getting all the credit. And Sextus Cloelius is one of the few times we get a glimpse at the equivalent of a Capitol Hill staffer. If I'm looking for any one person that he could be like, he is someone who was much more famous than his status would seem to warrant. He's also someone who was accused of being degenerate and had his character smeared relentlessly. At one point, Cicero even accuses him of being kept around because Clodia liked the way that he performed cunnilingus. And so I can't help but think that Sextus Cloelius, at the end of the day, is the Roman Republic's Monica Lewinsky. Much like Monica Lewinsky, he probably was not that bad. He was just a guy who had an opportunity, and he took it. It didn't pan out in the end. But unlike Monica, Sextus Cloelius did have a fairly long run. And he was a part of Clodius's inner circle. Clodius was one of the most powerful members of the Senate for about 6 years. And given that Clodius was not a member of the Senate at all, and that he wouldn't have qualified as rich exactly in the eyes of people in the Senate, that was quite a run that he had. And so, again, I just leave you with the idea that Cloelius was exactly the kind of guy that you don't really see, but he was more representative of the people who actually got the business of government done than a lot of the more prominent figures in Roman life. I'm Thersites the historian, and next time we'll come back and talk about someone else who perhaps was a good analog for some other modern figure. But again, I just thought of the Monica Lewinsky thing at the last minute. I think it works, though. Let me know what you think about this. Is Sextus Cloelius the Monica Lewinsky of Rome? Till then, I will see you around.